Hello, everybody. Let me see if I can change this lighting so I can better see. I can better see what I look like there. Excuse me. We'll let the clock go, and then let me come right over here, and we have to do all of the sharing. Let's see. Your channel. There we go. Let's see. At the back of the North Wind, live, part 9. Okay, 3 watching. Hello, 3 who are watching. Let me share this one. I have to share it to the Facebook, as you know. We'll do this paste here. There we go. And then we'll do John Maxwell. Good evening. Colette, you did make it. Hello, Empress Heather. Well, I'm so glad you did. I've been doing classic stories, and that's what we're doing. Good evening, sweet Ciara. Eileen Murphy. Hello. Let me just share this with the socials of media. 1 second. As I was telling people on Facebook, I really should do the Restream app because it goes to all of them. But it's kind of expensive, and I just didn't want to spend the money. Story time is live. We'll click that button, and then we have one more media social. Christy, I'm doing well. Hello, Joan. I'm thinking of you. Thank you for being here. Let me go over here to this one. Paste it here. And post that. Okay. Now, thank you very much. Om Shanti Shanti Om. Thank you. Merlin and the Fey King's Crown. Hello. Hello, Bakwa 62. For those of you who are just joining me, I so appreciate each and every one of you. I would like to say one minor thing, and I see so many names that are fairly new, and welcome. My first name is actually Richard-Lael. There's a reason. I mean, it is my birth name, but Richard-Lael is my first name. Richard-Lael. Once you say it, it becomes easier. Richard-Lael Lillard is the whole name. I left my book right over here. One moment. So we'll let this clock go. Ask not for whom the bell tolls for thee. Actually, for those of you who are regular viewers of my channel, those who follow me on a regular basis, know that I was not here last week because my mother was ill last week. She had cancer, and then she passed away on Sunday morning. And she was my best friend. She was the dearest, kindest person to me since, for all of my years of existence. And we didn't see eye to eye on a lot of issues, but she was my best friend. And thank you so much, Heather. Thank you, Empress Heather. Yeah, my mother was my best friend, and she is no longer suffering. And where I miss her terribly, she was always afraid of not being able to breathe. And the cancer made it where she couldn't breathe. So I am glad she is no longer in pain. That is a peaceful blessing for me. And everyone has been so very kind. Thank you for all of your well wishes, all of your condolences. I spoke to her, I think, the day before she passed. She was so bad the last day that she mostly just slept, and I didn't want to disturb her. But I told her I loved her, and yeah, she was my best friend. But anyway, I wanted to go back into story time tonight because I thought that it would be nice to get back into some sort of vein of normalcy. And we are reading At the Back of the North Wind, which I do enjoy so very much. Before I do, I want to talk a little bit about my pins. So this one is Fallen Lucifer, and this one is Baphomet right here. I wore this one the other day, and people only this one, and people were asking me, "Now, tell me about that pin. Tell me about." And I said, "Well, it's as above, so below. It's basically balance in all things. It is light and dark, male and female. It's that bringing the illumination, and that, my dear friends, across the world, across the time, is what I like to do. I like to bring illumination." And without further ado, my darlings, I think now would be a good time. We'll go ahead and start the book, but one more thing. I wanted to go ahead and plug this in case you are interested. This is sort of more of a personal fun side. Um, I will be doing a seance live. You can go to University Magicus. It's not expensive. It's like a couple of cups of coffee. It's at Starbucks. It's not expensive. So if you would like to participate in that, you can go over to University Magicus and you can find me there. So you can join me in a seance on Sunday. I think it's 2:30. My time is off, but it's 2:30 on the Eastern and 11:30 on the Pacific. So wherever you are, you can join me there. And we are almost through with this book. So we will start tonight with chapter 25, 26, 27, 28. Chapter 28. Little Daylight. No house of any pretension to be called a palace is in the least worthy of the name, except it has wood near it, very near it, and the nearer the better. Not all round it. I don't mean that. For a palace ought to be open to the sun and wind, and stand high, high and brave, with weathercocks glittering and flags flying. But on the side of every palace there must be a wood, and there was a very grand wood indeed beside the palace of the king, who was going to be Daylight's father. Such a grand wood that nobody yet had ever got to the other end of it. Near the house it was kept very trim and nice, and it was free of brushwood for a long way in, but by degrees it got wild, and it grew wilder and wilder and wilder, until some said wild beasts hunted. However, and this kept the wild beasts far away from the palace. Oh, I'm sorry. Uh, Beasts at last did what they liked in it. The king and his courtiers often hunted. However, and this kept the wild beasts far away from the palace. One glorious summer morning, when the wind and sun were out together, when the vanes were flashing and the flags frolicking against the blue sky, Little Daylight made her appearance from somewhere, nobody could tell where, a beautiful baby with such bright eyes that she might have come from the sun, only by and by she showed such lively ways that she might equally well have come out of the wind. There was a great jubilation in the palace, for this was the first baby the queen had had, and there is as much happiness over a new baby in a palace as in a cottage. And there is one disadvantage of living near a wood. You do not know quite who your neighbors may be. Everybody knew there were there were in it several fairies living within a few miles of the palace, who always had something to do with each new baby that came. For fairies live so much longer than we that they can have businesses with a good many generations of human mortals. The curious houses they lived in were well known also. One a hollow oak, another a birch tree, though nobody could ever find how that fairy made a house of it. Another a hut of growing trees intertwined and patched up with turf and moss. But there was another fairy who had lately come to the place, and nobody even knew she was a fairy, except for other fairies. A wicked old thing she was, always concealing her power, and being as disagreeable as she could, in order to tempt people to give her offence, that she might have the pleasure of taking vengeance upon them. The people about thought she was a witch, and those who knew her by sight were careful to avoid offending her. She lived in a mud house in a swampy part of the forest. In all history, we find that fairies give their remarkable gifts to prince or princesses or any child of sufficient importance in their eyes, always at the christening. Now, this we can understand because it is an ancient custom amongst human beings as well, and it is not hard to explain why wicked fairies should choose the same time to do unkind things. But it is difficult to understand how they should be able to do them. For if you would fancy all wicked creatures would be powerless on such an occasion, but I never knew of any interference on the part of a wicked fairy that did not turn out a good thing in the end. What a good thing, for instance, it was one princess should sleep for 100 years. Was she not saved from all the plague of the young men who were not worthy of her? And did she not come awake exactly at the right moment, when the right prince kissed her? For my part, I cannot help wishing a good many girls would sleep till just the same fate overtook them. It would be happier for them, and more agreeable for their friends. Of course, all the known fairies are invited to the christening, but the king and queen never thought of inviting an old witch, for the power of the fairies have they have by nature, whereas a witch gets her power by wickedness. The other fairies, however, knowing the danger thus run, provided as well as they could against accidents from her quarter, but they could neither render her powerless, nor could they arrange their gifts in reference to hers beforehand, for they could not tell what those might be. Of course, the old hag was there without being asked. Not to be asked was just what she wanted, that she might have a sort of reason for doing what she wished to do. For somehow, even the wickedest of creatures likes a pretext for doing the wrong thing. 5 fairies had one after another given the child such gifts as each counted best, and the 5th had just stepped back to her place in the surrounding splendor of ladies and gentlemen when, mumbling a laugh between her toothless gums, the wicked fairy hobbled out into the middle of the circle, and at the moment when the archbishop was handing the baby to the lady at the head of the nursery department of the state of affairs, addressed him thus, giving a bite or two of every word before she could part with it. "Please, your grace, I'm very deaf. Would your grace mind repeating the princess's name?" "With pleasure, my good woman," said the archbishop, stooping to shout in her ear. "The infant's name is Little Daylight." "And little daylight it shall be," cried the fairy in the tone of a dry axle. "And little good shall any of her gifts do her, for I bestow upon her the gift of sleeping all day, whether she will it or not." Then out started the sixth fairy, who, of course, the others had arranged should come after the wicked one in order to undo as much as she might. If she sleep all day, she said mournfully, she shall at least wake all night. A nice prospect for her mother and me, thought the poor king, and they loved her far too much to give her up to the nurses, especially at night, as most kings and queens do, and are sorry for it afterwards. You spoke before I had done, said the wicked fairy. That's against the law, and it gives me another chance. I beg your pardon, said the other fairies altogether. She did not. I hadn't. She did. I hadn't done laughing, said the crone. I had only got to ha ha ha, and I had to go through the ho ho ho, ha 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 ha. So I decree that if she wakes all night, she shall wax and wane with its mistress the moon. And what that may mean, I hope her royal parents will live to see. Ha 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 ha. But out stepped another fairy, for they had been wise enough to keep two in reserve, because every fairy knew the trick of one until, said the seventh fairy, a prince comes who shall kiss her without knowing it. The wicked fairy made a horrid noise like an angry cat and hobbled away. She could not pretend that she had not finished her speech this time, for she had laughed ho ho and hoo hoo. I don't know what that means, said the poor king to the seventh fairy. Don't be afraid. The meaning will come with the thing itself, said she. The assembly broke up, miserable enough. The queen, at least, prepared for a good many sleepless nights, and the lady at the head of the nursery department anything but comfortable in the prospect for her, for of course the queen could not do it all. As for the king, he made up his mind with what courage he could summon to meet the demands of the case, but wondered whether he could with any propriety require the first lord of the treasury to take share of the burden laid upon him. I will not attempt to describe what they had to go through for some time, but at last the household settled into a regular system, a very irregular one in some respects, for at certain seasons the palace rang all night with bursts of laughter from Little Daylight, whose heart the old fairy's curse could not reach. She was Daylight still, only a little in the wrong place, for she always dropped asleep at the first hint of the dawn in the east. But her merriment was of short duration. When the moon was at the full, she was in glorious spirits, and as beautiful as it was possible for a child her age to be. But as the moon waned, she faded, until at last she was wan and withered like the poorest, sickliest child you might come upon in the streets of the great city in the arms of a homeless mother. Then the night was quiet as the day, for the little creature lay in her gorgeous cradle night and day with hardly a motion, and indeed at last without even a moan, like one dead. At first they often thought she was dead, but at last they got used to it, and only consulted the almanac to find the moment when she would begin to revive, which, of course, was the first appearance of the silver thread of the crescent moon. Then she would move her lips, and they would give her a little nourishment, and she would grow better and better and better, until for a few days she was splendidly well. When well, she always was the merriest out in the moonlight, but even when near her worst, she seemed better when, in warm summer nights, they carried her cradle out into the light of the waning moon. Then, in her sleep, she would smile the faintest, most pitiful smile. For a long time, very few people ever saw her awake, As she grew older, she became such a favorite, however, that about the palace there were always some who would contrive to keep awake at night in order to be near her. But she soon began to take every chance of getting away from her nurses and enjoying her moonlight alone. And thus things went on until she was nearly 17 years of age. Her father and mother had by that time got so used to the odd state of things that they had ceased to wonder at them. All their arrangements had reference to the state of the Princess Daylight, and it is amazing how things contrive to accommodate themselves, but how any prince was ever to find and deliver her appeared inconceivable. As she grew older, she had grown more and more beautiful, with the sunniest hair and the loveliest eyes of heavenly blue, brilliant and profound as the sky of June day. But so much more painful and sad was the change as her bad time came on. The more beautiful she was in the full moon, the more withered and worn she did become as the moon waned. At the time at which my story has now arrived, she looked, when the moon was small or gone, like an old woman, exhausted with suffering. This was the more painful that her appearance was unnatural, for her hair and eyes did not change. Her wan face was both drawn and wrinkled, and had an eager, hungry look. Her skinny hands moved as if wishing but unable to lay hold of something. Her shoulders were bent forward, her chest went in, and she stooped as she were 80 years old. At last she had to be put to bed, and there await for the flow to the tide of life. But she grew to dislike being seen, still more being touched by any hands during this season. Only lovely summer evening, when the moon lay all but gone upon the verge of horizon, she vanished from her attendants, and it was only after searching for her a long time in great terror that they found her fast asleep in the forest at the foot of the silver birch, and carried her home. A little way from the palace there was a great open glade, covered with the greenest and softest grass. This was her favorite haunt, for here the full moon shone free and glorious, while through a vista in the trees she could generally see more or less of the dying moon as it crossed the opening. Here she had a little rustic house built for her, and here she mostly resided. None of the court might go there without leave, and her own attendants had learned by this time not to be officious in waiting upon her, so that she was very much at liberty. Whether the good fairies had anything to do with it or not, I cannot tell. But at last she got into the way of retreating further into the wood every night as the moon waned, so that sometimes they had a great trouble in finding her. But as she was always very angry if she discovered they were watching her, they scarcely dared to do so. At length, one night, they thought they had lost her altogether. It was morning before they found her, feeble as she was. She had wandered into the thickest long way from the glade, and there she lay fast asleep, of course. Although the fame of her beauty and sweetness had gone abroad, yet, as everybody knew she was under a bad spell, no king in the neighborhood had any desire to have her for a daughter-in-law. There were serious objections to such a relation. About this time in the neighboring kingdom, in consequence of wickedness of the nobles, an insurrection took place upon the death of the old king. The greater part of nobility was massacred, and the young prince was compelled to flee for his life, disguised like a peasant. For some time, until he got out of the country, he suffered much from hunger and fatigue, but when he got into that ruled by the princess's father, and had no longer any fear of being recognized, he fared better, for the people were kind. He did not abandon his disguise, however. One tolerable reason was that he had no other clothes to put on, and another that he had very little money and did not know where to get any more. There was no good in telling everybody he met that he was a prince, for he felt that a prince ought to be able to get on like other people, else his rank only made a fool of him. He had read of princesses setting out upon adventure, and here he was out in a similar case, only without having had a choice in the matter. He would go on and see what would come of it. For a day or two he had been walking through the palace wood, and had next to nothing to eat, when he came upon the strangest little house, inhabited by a very nice, tidy, motherly old woman. This was one of the good fairies. The moment she saw him, she knew quite well who he was, and what was going to come of it. But she was not at liberty to interfere with the orderly march of events. She received him with the kindness she would have shown to any other traveler, and gave him bread and milk, which he thought the most delicious food he had ever had tasted, wondering that they did not have it for dinner at the palace sometimes. The old woman pressed him to stay all night. When he awoke, he was amazed to find how well and strong he felt. She would not take any of the money he offered, but begged him, if he found occasion of continuing in the neighborhood, to return and occupy the same quarters. "Thank you so much, good mother," answered the prince, "but there is little chance of that. The sooner I get out of this wood, the better." "I don't know that," said the fairy. "What do you mean?" asked the prince. "How Why, how should I know?" returned she. "I can't tell," said the prince. "Very well," said the fairy. "How strangely you talk," said the prince. "Do I?" said the fairy. "Yes, you do," said the prince. "Very well," said the fairy. The prince was not used to being spoken to in this fashion, so he felt a little angry, and turned and walked away. But this did not offend the fairy. She stood at the door of her little house, looking after him till the trees hid him quite. Then she said, "At last," and went in. The prince wandered and got nowhere. The sun sank and went out of sight, and he seemed no nearer to the end of the wood than ever. He sat down on the fallen tree, ate a bit of bread the old woman had given him, and waited for the moon. For although he was not much of an astronomer, he knew the moon would rise sometime, because she had risen the night before. Up she came, slow and slow, but of good size, pretty nearly round indeed, whereupon, greatly refreshed with his piece of bread, he got up and went. He knew not whither. After walking a considerable distance, he thought he was coming to the outside of the forest, but when he reached what he thought at last of it, he found himself only upon the edge of a great open space in it, covered with grass. The moon shone very bright, and he thought he had never seen a more lovely spot. Still, it looked dreary because of its loneliness, for he could not see the house at the other side. He sat down, weary again, and gazed into the glade. He had not seen so much room for several days. All at once, he spied something in the middle of the grass. What could it be? It moved. A girl, dressed in white, gleaming in the moonshine. She came nearer and nearer. He crept behind a tree and watched, wondering it must be some strange being of the wood, a nymph whom the moonlight and the warm, dusky air had enticed from her tree. But when she came close to where he stood, he no longer doubted she was human, for he had caught sight of her sunny hair and her clear blue eyes and the loveliest face and form that he had ever seen. All at once she began singing like a nightingale and dancing to her own music, with eyes ever turned towards the moon. She passed close to where he stood, dancing on the edge of the trees, and away in a great circle towards the other side. until he could see but a spot of white in the yellowish green of the moonlit grass. But when he feared it would vanish quite, the spot grew and became a figure once more. She approached him again, singing and dancing and waving her arms over her head, until she had completed the circle. Just opposite his tree, she stood, ceased her song, dropped her arms, and broke out into a long, clear laugh, musical as a brook. Then, as if tired, she threw herself on the grass and lay gazing at the moon. The prince was almost afraid to breathe, lest he should startle her and she should vanish from his sight. As to venturing near her, that never came into his head. She had lain for a long hour or longer, when the prince began again to doubt concerning her. Perhaps she was but a vision of his own fancy, or was she a spirit of the wood after all? If so, he too would haunt the wood, glad to have lost kingdom and everything for the hope of being near her. He would build him a hut in the forest, and there he would live for the pure chance of seeing her again. Upon nights like this, at least, she would come out and bask in the moonlight, and make his soul blessed. But while thus dreamed, she sprang to her feet, turned full face to the moon, and began singing as if she would draw her down from the sky by the power of her entrancing voice. She looked more beautiful than ever. Again she began dancing to her own music, and danced away into the distance. Once more she returned in a similar manner, but although he was watching as eagerly as before, what with fatigue and what with gazing, he fell fast asleep before she came near him. When he awoke, it was broad daylight, and the princess was nowhere. He could not leave the place. What if she should come the next night? He would gladly endure a day of hunger to see her yet again. He would buckle his belt quite tight. He walked round the glade to see if he could discover any prints of her feet, but the grass was so short, and her steps had been so light, that she had not left a single trace behind her. He walked halfway round the wood without seeing anything to account for her presence. Then he spied a lovely little house with a thatched roof and low eaves, surrounded by an exquisite garden, with doves and peacocks walking in it. Of course, this must be where the gracious lady who loved the moonlight lived. Forgetting his appearance, he walked towards the door, determined to make inquiries, but as he passed a little pond full of gold and silver fishes, he caught sight of himself and turned to find the door to the kitchen, where he knocked and asked for a piece of bread. The good-natured cook brought him in and gave him an excellent breakfast, which the prince found nothing the worse for being served in the kitchen. While he ate, he talked with his entertainer and learned that this was the favorite retreat of the Princess Daylight, but he learned nothing more, both because he was afraid of seeming inquisitive and because the cook did not choose to be heard talking about her mistress to a peasant lad who had begged for his breakfast. As he rose to take his leave, it occurred to him that he might not be so far from the old woman's cottage as he had thought, and he asked the cook whether she knew anything of such a place, describing it as well as he could. She said she knew it well enough, adding with a smile, "It's there you're going, is it?" "Yes, if it's not far off." "It's not more than 3 miles, but mind you, what you about, you know." "What do you say? Why do you say that?" "If you're ever any mischief, she'll make you repent it." "The best thing that could happen under the circumstances," remarked the prince. "What do you mean by that?" asked the cook. "Why, it stands to reason," answered the prince, "that if you wish to do anything wrong, the best thing for you to do is to be made to repent of it." "I see," said the cook. "Well, I think you may venture. She's a good old soul." "Which way does it lie from here?" asked the prince. She gave him full instructions, and he left her with many thanks. Being now refreshed, however, the prince did not go back to the cottage that day, but remained in the forest, amusing himself as best he could, but waiting anxiously for the night in hope that the princess would appear again. Nor was he disappointed, for directly the moon rose, he spied a glimmering shape far across the glade. As it drew nearer, he saw it was she indeed, not dressed in white as before, in pale blue like the sky. She looked lovelier still. He thought it was that blue suited her yet better than the white. He did not know what she was really more beautiful because the moon was nearer the full. In fact, the next night was the full moon, and the princess would then be at her zenith of her loveliness. The prince feared for some time that she was not coming near his hiding place that night. But the circles in her dance ever widened as the moon rose, until at last they embraced the whole glade, and she came still closer to the trees where he was hiding than she had come the night before. He was entranced with her loveliness, for it was indeed a marvelous thing. All night long he watched her, but dared not go to her. He would have been ashamed of watching her too, had he not become almost incapable of thinking of anything but how beautiful she was. He watched the whole night long, and saw that the moon went down and retreated in smaller and smaller circles, until at last he could see her no more. Weary as he was, he set out for the old woman's cottage, where he arrived just in time for her breakfast, which she shared with him, then went to bed and slept for many hours. When he awoke, the sun was down, and he departed in great anxiety, lest he should lose a glimpse of the lovely vision. But whether it was by the machinations of the swamp fairy, or merely that is one thing to go and another to return by the same road, he lost his way. I shall not attempt to describe his misery when the moon rose, and he saw nothing but trees, trees, trees. She was high in the heavens before he reached the glade. Then indeed his troubles vanished, for there was the princess coming dancing toward him, in a dress that shone like gold, and with shoes that glimmered through the grass like fireflies. She was, of course, still more beautiful than before. Like an embodied sunbeam, she passed him and danced away into the distance. Before she returned in her circle, clouds had begun to gather about the moon. The wind rose, the trees moaned, and their lighter branches leaned all one way before it. The prince feared that the princess would go in, and he should see her no more that night. But she came dancing on more jubilant than ever, her golden dress and her sunny hair streaming out upon the blast, waving her arms toward the moon, and in exuberance of her delight, ordering the clouds away from off her face. The prince could hardly believe she was not a creature of the elements after all. By the time she had completed another circle, the clouds had gathered deep, and there were growlings of distant thunder. Just as she passed the tree where he stood, a flash of lightning blinded him in a moment, and when he saw again, to his horror, the princess lay on the ground. He darted to her, thinking she had been struck, but when she heard him coming, she was on her feet in a moment. "What do you want?" she asked. "I beg your pardon. I thought—" "The lightning," said the prince, hesitating. "There is nothing the matter," said the princess, waving him off rather haughtily. The poor prince turned and walked towards the wood. "Come back," said Daylight. "I like you. You do what you are told. Are you good?" "Not so good as I should like to be," said the prince. "Then go and grow better," said the princess. Again the disappointed prince turned and went. "Come back," said the princess. He obeyed, and stood before her waiting. "Can you tell me what the sun is like?" she asked. "No," he answered. "But where's the good of asking what you know?" "But I don't know," she rejoined. "Why, everybody knows. That's the very thing. I'm not everybody. I've never seen the sun." "Then you can't know what it's like till you do see it." "I think you must be a prince," said the princess. "Do I look like one?" said the prince. "I can't quite say that." "Then why do you think so?" "Because you both do what you are told and speak the truth. Is the sun so very bright?" "As bright as the lightning." "But it doesn't go out like that, does it?" "Oh, no. It shines like the moon, rises and sets like the moon, is much the same shape as the moon, only so bright that you can't look at it for a moment." "But I would look at it," said the princess. "But you couldn't," said the prince. "But I could," said the princess. "Why don't you then?" "Because I can't." "Why can't you?" "Because I can't awake, and I never shall awake until—" Here she hid her face in her hands, turned away, and walked in the slowest, stateliest manner toward the house. The prince ventured to follow her at the little distance, but she turned and made a repellent gesture, which, like a true gentleman prince, he obeyed at once. He waited a long time, but as she did not come near him again, and as the night had now cleared, he set off at last for the old woman's cottage. It was long past midnight when he reached it, but to his surprise the old woman was paring potatoes at the door. Fairies are fond of doing odd things. Indeed, however they may disassemble, the night is always their day, and so it is with all who have fairy blood in them. "Why, what are you doing there this time of the night, mother?" said the prince, for this was the kind of way in which any young man in his country would address a woman who was much older than himself. "Getting your supper ready, my son," she answered. "Oh, I don't want supper," said the prince. "Ah, you've seen daylight," said she. "I've seen a princess who never saw it," said the prince. "Do you like her?" asked the fairy. "Oh, don't I?" said the prince. "More than you would believe, mother. A fairy can believe anything that ever was or ever could be," said the old woman. "Then you are a fairy?" asked the prince. "Yes," said she. "Then what do you do for things not to believe?" asked the prince. "There's plenty of them. Everything that's never was, never or nor ever could be." "Plenty, I grant you," said the prince. "But do you believe there could be a princess who never saw daylight? Do you believe that now?" This the prince said, not that he doubted that the princess, but that he wanted the fairy to tell him more. She was too old a fairy, however, to be caught so easily off guard. Of all people, fairies must not tell secrets. Besides, she is a princess. "Well, I'll tell you a secret. I'm a prince." "I know that." "How do you know it?" "By the curl of the third eyelash on your left eyelid. Which corner do you count from?" "That's a secret." "Another secret. Well, at least, if I'm a prince, there can be no harm in telling me about a princess." "It's just a princess. I can't tell." "There ain't any more of them, are there?" said the prince. "What, you don't think you are the only prince in the world, do you?" "Oh, dear, no, not at all. But I know there's one too many just at present, except the princess." Yes, 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 that's it," said the fairy. "What's it?" asked the prince. But he could get nothing more out of the fairy, and had to go to bed unanswered, which was something of a trial. Now, wicked fairies will not be bound by the laws which the good fairies obey, and this always seems to give the bad the advantage over the good, for they use means to gain their ends, which the others will not. But it is all of no consequence, for what they do never succeeds, Nay, in the end, it brings about the very thing they're trying to prevent. So if you see that somehow, for all their cleverness, wicked fairies are dreadfully stupid. For although from the beginning of the world they have really helped instead of thwarting the good fairies, not one of them is a bit the wiser for it. She will try the bad thing just as they all did before her, and succeeds no better, of course. The prince had so far stolen a march upon the swamp fairy that she did not know he was in the neighborhood until after he had seen the princess those 3 times. When she knew it, she consoled herself by thinking that the princess must be far too proud and too modest for any young man to venture even to speak to her before he had seen her 6 times at least. But there was even less danger than the wicked fairy thought, for however much the princess might desire to be set free, she was dreadfully afraid of the wrong prince. Now, however, the fairy was going to do all she could. She so contrived it by her deceitful spells that the next night the prince could not by any endeavor find his way to the glade. It would take me too long to tell her tricks. They would be amusing to us. Who knows that they who know that they could not do any harm, but they were something other than amusing to the poor prince. He wandered about the forest till daylight, and then fell fast asleep. The same thing occurred for 7 following days, which neither could he find the good fairy's cottage after the 3rd quarter of the moon. However, the bad fairy thought she might be at ease about the affair for a fortnight at least, for there was no chance of the prince wishing to kiss the princess during that period. So the first day of the 4th quarter he did find the cottage, and the next day he found the glade. For nearly another week he haunted it, but the princess never came. I have little doubt she was on the farther edge at some point every night, but at this period she always wore black, and, there being little or no light, the prince never saw her. Nor would he have known her if he had seen her. How could he have taken the worn, decrepit creature she was now for the glorious Princess Daylight? At last, one night, when there was no moon at all, he ventured near the house. Then he heard voices talking, although it was past midnight, for her women were in considerable uneasiness, because the one whose turn it was to watch her had fallen asleep, and had not seen which way she went, and this was a night when she would probably wander very far, describing a circle which did not touch the open glade at all, but stretched away from the back of the house, deep into that side of the forest, a part of which the prince knew nothing. When he understood from what they said that she had disappeared, and that she might have gone somewhere in the said direction, he plunged at once into the wood to see if he could find her. For hours he roamed with nothing to guide him but the vague notion of a circle, which, on one side, bordered on the house, for so much had he picked up from the talk that he overheard. It was getting towards dawn, but as yet there was no streak of light in the sky, when he came to a great birch tree and sat down weary of it, at the foot of it. While he sat, very miserable, you may be sure, full of fear for the princess, and wondering how her attendants could take it so quietly, he bethought himself that it would not be bad plan to light a fire, which, if she were anywhere near, would attract her. This he managed with a tinder-box, which the good fairy had given him. It was just the beginning to blaze up when he heard a moan, which seemed to come from the other side of the tree. He sprung to his feet, but his heart throbbed so that he had to lean for a moment against the tree before he could move. When he got round, There lay a human form in the little dark heap on the earth. There was light enough from his fire to show that it was not the princess. He lifted his arms, hardly heavier than a child, and carried it to the flame. The countenance was that of an old woman, but it had fearfully strange look. A black hood concealed her hair, and her eyes were closed. He laid her down as comfortably as he could, chafed her hands, put a little cordial from a bottle, also the gift of the fairy, into her mouth, took off his coat and wrapped it about her, and in short did the best he could. In a little while she opened her eyes and looked at him, so pitifully. The tears rose and flowed down her grey, wrinkled cheeks, but she said never a word. She closed her eyes again, but the tears kept flowing, and her whole appearance was so utterly pitiful that the prince was very near crying too. He begged her to tell him what was the matter, promising to do all he could to help her, but still she did not speak. He thought she was dying, and took her in his arms again to carry her to the princess's house, where he thought the good-natured cook might be able to do something for her. When he lifted her, the tears flowed yet faster, and she gave such a sad moan that it went to his very heart. "Oh, mother, mother," he said, "poor mother," and kissed her on the withered lips. She started, and what eyes they were that opened upon him! But he did not see them, for it was still very dark, and he had enough to do to make his way through the trees towards the house. Just as he approached the door, feeling more tired than he could have imagined possible, as she was such a little thin old thing, she began to move, and became so restless and unable to carry her at a moment longer. He thought to lay her upon the grass, but she stood upright on her feet. Her hood had dropped, and her hair fell about her. The first gleam of the morning was caught on her face. That face was bright as the never-aging dawn. Her eyes were lovely as the sky of the darkest blue. The prince recoiled in overmastering wonder. It was Daylight herself, whom he had brought from the forest. He fell at her feet, nor dared look up until she laid her hand upon his head. He rose then. "You kissed me when I was an old woman there. I kiss you when I am a young princess," murmured Daylight. "Is that the sun coming?" Let's see how long this next chapter is. The next one is a short chapter. We have 10 minutes. Excuse me. Chapter 29, Ruby. The children were delighted with the story and made many amusing remarks upon it. Mr. Raymond promised to search his brain for another, and when he had found one, to bring it to them. Diamond, having taken leave of Nanny, and promised to go and see her again soon, went away with him. Now Mr. Raymond had been turning over in his mind what he could do both for Diamond and for Nanny. He had therefore made some acquaintance with Diamond's father, and had been greatly pleased with him. But he had come to the resolution, before he did anything so good as he would like to do for them, to put them all to a certain test. So as they walked together, he began to talk with Diamond as follows. "Nanny must leave the hospital soon, Diamond." "I am glad of that, sir." "Why? Don't you think it's a nice place?" "Yes, very, but it's better to be well and doing something, you know, even if it's not quite so comfortable." "But they can't keep Nanny so long as they would like. They can't keep her till she's quite strong. There are always so many sick children they want to take it in and make better, and the question is, what will she do when they send her out again? That's just what I can't tell, though I've been thinking of it over and over, sir. Her crossing was taken long ago, and I couldn't bear to see Nanny fighting for it. especially with such a poor fellow as she has taken. He's quite lame, sir. She doesn't look much like fighting now, does she, Diamond? No, sir. She looks more like an angel. Angels don't fight, do they, sir? Not to get things for themselves, at least, said Mr. Raymond. Besides, added Diamond, I don't quite see that she would have any better right to the crossing than the boy who's got it now. Nobody gave it to her. She only took it, and now he has taken it. If she were to sweep a crossing, soon at least, after the illness she has had, she would be laid up again in the very first wet day, said Mr. Raymond. And there's hardly any money to be got, except the wet days, remarked Diamond reflectively. Is there nothing else she could do, sir? Not without being taught, I'm afraid. Well, couldn't somebody teach her something? Couldn't you teach her, Diamond? I don't know anything myself, sir. I could teach her to dress the baby, but nobody would give her anything for doing things like that. They're so easy. They wouldn't be as much good in teaching her to drive a cab, for where would she get a cab to drive? There ain't fathers and old diamonds everywhere. At least poor Nanny can't find any of them, I doubt. Perhaps, if she were taught to be nice and clean, and only speak gentle words. Mother could teach her that, interrupted Diamond, and to dress babies and feed them and take care of them. Mr. Raymond proceeded. She might get a place as a nurse somewhere, you know. People do give money for that. Then I'll ask Mother, said Diamond. But you'll have to give her food then, and your father, not being strong, has enough to do already without that. But here's me, said Diamond. I help him out with it. When he's tired of driving, up I get. It don't make any difference to old Diamond. I don't mean he likes me as well as my father, of course. He can't, you know. Nobody could, but he does his duty the same. It's got to be done, you know, sir, and Diamond's a good horse, isn't he, sir? From your description, I should say certainly, but I have not the pleasure of his acquaintance myself. Don't you think he will go to heaven, sir? Don't you think he will go to heaven, sir? That I don't know anything about, said Mr. Raymond. I confess I should be glad to think so, he added, smiling thoughtfully. I'm sure you'll get back up to the back of the north wind somehow, said Diamond to himself, but he had learned to be very careful of saying such things aloud. Isn't it rather too much for him to go in the cab all day and every day? Resumed Mr. Raymond. So father says, when he feels the ribs of a morning, but then he says the old horse do eat well, and the moment he's had his supper, down he goes, and never gets up till he's called. And for the legs of him, father says that makes no end of difference. Some horses, sir, they won't lie down all night long, but go to sleep on their four pins like a haystack. Father says, I think it's very stupid of them, and so does old Diamond. But then I suppose they don't know better, and so they can't help it. We mustn't be too hard upon them, father says. Your father must be a good man, Diamond. Diamond looked upon Mr. Raymond's face, wondering what he could mean. I said your father must be a good man, Diamond. Of course, said Diamond. How could he drive a cab if he wasn't? There are some men who drive cabs who are not very good, objected Mr. Raymond. Diamond remembered the drunken cabman and saw that his friend... That's for sure. Oh, yeah. Diamond remembered the drunken cabman and saw his father's friend was right. Saw that his friend was right. Ah, but he returned, he must be, you know, with such a horse as old Diamond. That does make a difference, said Mr. Raymond, but it is quite enough that he is a good man without our trying to account for it. Now, if you like, I will give you proof that I think him to be a good man. I am going away on the continent for a while, for 3 months, I believe, and I am going to let my house to a gentleman who does not want to use the use of my brougham, My horse is nearly as old, I fancy, as your Diamond, but I don't want to part with him, and I don't want him to be idle, for nobody, as you say, ought to be idle, but neither do I want him to be worked very hard. Now, it has come into my head that perhaps your father would take charge of him and work him under certain conditions. My father will do what's right, said Diamond. I'm sure of that. Well, so I think. Will you ask him for when he comes home to call and have a little chat with me today sometime? He must have his dinner first, said Diamond. No, he's got to have he's got his dinner with him today. It must be after he's had his tea. Of course, of course. Any time will do. I shall be at home all day. Very well, sir. I will tell him. You may be sure he will come. My father thinks you a very kind gentleman, and I know he is right, for I know your very own self, sir. Mr. Raymond smiled, and as they had now reached his door, they parted, and Diamond went home. As soon as his father entered the house, Diamond gave him Mr. Raymond's message and recounted the conversation that had preceded it. His father said little, but took thought sauce to his bread and butter, and as soon as he had finished his meal, rose, saying, I will go to your friend directly, Diamond. It would be a grand thing to get a little more money. We do want it. Diamond accompanied his father to Mr. Raymond's door, and there left him. He was shown at once into Mr. Raymond's study, where he gazed with some wonder at the multitude of books on the walls, and thought, what a learned man Mr. Raymond must be. Presently Mr. Raymond entered, and, after saying much of the same about his old horse, made the following distinct proposal, one not over advantageous to Diamond's father, but for which he had reasons, namely, that Joseph should have the use of Mr. Raymond's horse while he was away, on condition that he never worked him more than 6 hours a day, and fed him well, and that, besides, he should take Nanny home as soon as she was able to leave the hospital, and provide for her for as one of his own children, neither better nor worse, so long, that is, as he had the horse. Diamond's father could not help thinking it a pretty close bargain, for she should have both the girl and the horse to feed, and only 6 hours' work out of the horse. It will save your own horse, said Mr. Raymond. That is true, answered Joseph, but all I can get by my own horse is only enough to keep us, and if I save him and feed your horse and the girl, don't you see, sir? Well, you can go home and think about it, and let me know by the end of the week. I am in no hurry before then. So Joseph went home and recounted the proposal to his wife. Adding that he did not think there was much advantage to be got out of it. Not much that way, husband, said Diamond's mother, but there would be an advantage, and what matter who gets it? I don't see it, answered her husband. Mr. Raymond is a gentleman of property, and I don't discover any much good in helping him to save a little more. He won't easily get one to take such a bargain, and I don't mean he shall get me. It would be a loss rather than a gain, I do think at least, if I took less work out of our own horse. 1 hour would make a difference to old Diamond, but that's not the main point. You must think what an advantage it would be to the poor girl that hasn't a home to go to. She is one of Diamond's friends, thought his father. I could be kind to her, you know, the mother went on, and teach her housework and how to handle a baby, and besides, she would help me, and I should be the stronger for it, and able to do an odd bit of cleaning, charring now and then, when I got the chance. I won't hear of that, said her husband. Have the girl by all means. I'm ashamed I did not think of both sides of this thing at once. I wonder if the horse is a great eater. To be sure, if I gave Diamond 2 hours additional rest, it would be all the better for the old bones of him. and there would be 4 hours extra out of the other horse. That would give Diamond something to do every day. He could drive old Diamond after dinner, and I could take the other horse out for 6 hours after tea or in the morning. As I found best, it might pay for the keep of both of them. That is, if I had good luck. I should like to oblige Mr. Raymond, though he be rather hard, for he has been very kind to our Diamond. Wife, hasn't he now? He has indeed, Joseph, said his wife. And there the conversation ended. Diamond's father went the very next day to Mr. Raymond and accepted his proposal, so that the week after, having got another stall in the same stable, he had 2 horses instead of 1. Oddly enough, the name of the new horse was Ruby, for he was very red and chestnut. Diamond's name came from his white lozenge on his forehead. Young Diamond said they were rich now, with such a big diamond and such a big ruby. We continue next week. You must forgive, I have some little bit of some congestion in my chest. Let me go through and read some of what we have here. Sorry for your loss. Thank you. Life of Fringe. Condolences. Thank you. Good evening, Bonnie. Do I have a wife? No, I do not have a wife. Merlin and the Fey King's Crown, much love. Thank you so much. Big brother. Hello, Cody. Good to see you, my friend. Trouble is here. You are indeed. Anonymous R. I'm not a Satanist, but I do enjoy the videos. Thank you. Good morning, Richard-Lael. Hello. Looking well, Richard-Lael. Ave Lucifer. Ave Lucifer. I'm a little late. Watch the first half tomorrow as I do my house chores. Listens intently. Good. I'm glad you made it. You uplift my spirit. Thank you, Cody. The feeling is mutual. Roses and Rue goodness. Roses and Rue goodness. I missed most of it. You can always go back. Shrouded Grove says, I miss story time sometimes because I'm in the UK and it's 3 a.m. when Richard-Lael begins to read. But as long as I turn up to support the channel and hear his Victorian voice, I'm happy. Thank you so much. Rose and Rue says he's quite charming. I appreciate that. Shrouded Grove says he's unique, and indeed. Lauren Morgan Richards, thank you so much. All right, my lovelies, if you are enjoying my channel, this is where I tell you can go to support me. If it doesn't cause any harm for you or any pain for you, I know I have to redo my site, but you can find me on the Patreon under the Gentleman's House. And again, forgive my congestion. I don't always sound like this. Nonetheless, if you can't, it's fine. If you can't support, I am still running for the next few days. I am running a discount on all services that are received. So look for me on thegentlemanpsychic.com. And I appreciate you. Also, if you want to join the seance on Sunday, you can go to universitymagicus.com and you can find the link there. And with that, my beauties, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your kindness, and be good to each other. Love to you. Until next week, good night.